Hello, everybody, and welcome to another talk. Today, we're going to be speaking with Ernst Wilhelm again. I think this is the third time now, but all good to have you back, Ernst. Pleased that you could take the time out to do this. I know you're super busy. The title of today's talk is going to be recommended text or recommended reading if you're interested in Jyotish. But I thought just before we get on to that, I wanted to just give people a little bit of background. I've been studying Jyotish for about 20 years now. And I remember when I first got my very first book, I think I picked up was an Ayurveda book. And at the back of the book, it was a David Frawley book. And he spoke a little bit about a book he'd done, which was called Astrology of the Seer, sorry, yeah. So I then purchased that book, read it, and I thought, yeah, I like this. And then did all the books that were in the rounds at that time, end of the 90s. So you had books by Robert Svoboda and Hart Defoe, and James Brihat published his ancient Hindu astrology. I mean, there was a whole kind of flurry of books that were popular at that time. And I remember I kind of digested all those, really enjoyed them. But then I wanted something more, so I thought I'd have a go and actually get some Indian English translations of Indian text, and it was just horrifying the difference between the two books. You were so used to the Western format and digesting information in that material, and the way that it's laid out, and then you get these Indian books, which is all kind of. I'm sure it makes great sense to them, but for us reading it for the first time, I just found it very confusing. But as time's gone on, and I've got more into the subject, I now find that I very rarely read those older Western books. I like the Indian books and I love reading them. I love the sort of quirkiness of them. I love the fact that you've got to really sort of dig into them a little bit and you can just sort of dip in and out. It's not that I read them from cover to cover. I'll sort of find an interesting chapter, read up on it, and it kind of draws me back into the subject. So I was lucky enough to get a copy of Hindu Astrology Jyotish Shastra, which is, I got a first edition of that by Shil Pandey, which was the sort of book that got me interested in Ayanamsha, if you like. And that was published in 1939. So I think I'll be right in saying that's probably the first Western published book on Jyotish. So obviously Shil wrote that book in an era when there was no Lahiri Ayanamsha.
Yeah,
Whatever.
yeah. There was also the Deluge. He wrote a book back then.
Right.
Uh,
Okay.
he had his own Ayanamsha. I don't know if that was before or after that. That might have been in the 20s, actually. I used to have that. I've never had the luck of finding the Chopin book. It's great you have a copy of that one.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
it was a quite it's a quirky book, and there's some oddities in there. He mentions the outer planets. There's a bit about Uranus and Neptune in there as well. But he's got a good section on nakshatras. It's nicely illustrated, but what a find, for that era. So much information that was there available, and yet it wasn't until the sort of later into the 80s, 90s that it began to get more popular and more books were brought forth. Anyway, my reason for saying all this is just obviously it's a bit daunting for somebody coming to this for the first time. And what books do you read? Which direction do you go? What would you recommend? So I thought you'd be a great person to talk to about this. And of course, there's the sort of Bible of astrology, the Brihat Parasara Hora Shastra, which everybody knows the name now. It's a very well known book in the West for Jyotish. But obviously, there's some controversy around its origins and the stories behind it. So I thought it'd be great to ask you on, and maybe you've kindly picked a few books that you found useful over the years. So perhaps you could sort of just take us through a stroll of your book collection and just try and give listeners an idea what would be good books as first time users, to introduce them to the topic, and the books you've picked. Why did you pick those? What's special about those when there are many books out there? So I'll turn it over to you, Ernst.
Yeah. And I think we're mostly going to talk about the classic books is what our goal was. And, there's so many modern books out there, more and more being produced all the time. But I think we need to kind of understand how astrology has kind of moved into the Western world. Um, we really owe most of that to David Frawley.
Hmm.
He's kind of the father of Vedic astrology in the Western world, especially in America. He was a successful, well-known Ayurvedic person, and so he had a great place to drop astrology into the world. And he actually is one that coined the idea of Vedic astrology. That term was never used before Frawley came up with it.
Hmm.
And so that's this idea of Vedic astrology is a very recent term. There is really no astrology in the actual Vedas themselves. There is a smattering in the Puranas. So it might be more accurate to call it Puranic astrology, but Vedic simply means true. And so if the Veda is what's true, so anything that is going to help us point us towards truth is a Veda, you know? And so it's a good name, but it's just interesting that a lot of people don't realize that. And he also based his first book and was based on Brihat Parasara Hora Shastra. And then that's his primary resource he gives at the end of the book as far as classical. And so that really boosted, I think, the awareness of this book, Brihat Parasara Hora Shastra. Okay. Now, what most people don't know is that this book was lost in India for a very long time. Back in the 11th century, there was an author in India who was the most well-known author, and he wrote extensive commentaries on many, many books, on Varaha, Mihira, on Prasna Marga. You know, he wrote these commentaries that made these books understandable to the average astrologer. Okay. And he said that while he's heard of Brihat Parasara Hora Shastra, he's actually never seen a copy. Okay. Now, the copy we currently have was brought together by a guy who around the end of the 1800s pulled together, went around India, found bits and scraps of what he believed to be Brihat Parasara, and compiled it into the form we have now. Okay. That's different than whatever used to be out there. So really, when we're looking at Brihat Parasara, there is some there that's probably attributable to the original Brihat Parasara, but we have to really look at it as a very wide collection of astrological information from around India. Okay. And regardless of that, it just happens to be one of the most important texts. Okay. It could have been a collection of stuff with some parashara in there that was absolutely useless. As it was, it turns out there's more useful things in that text than any other text. Okay. So it's really great that Frawley gave us this hyper awareness of this text, which I think we really kind of owe to him. Because like in India, you see the authors, they're largely quoting Varaha Mihira a lot. And he was one of the primary astrology guys. Bibi Rahman, who was in a more southern part of India, was very much into Varaha Mihira and these South Indian books that they use more in mid and South India. So we're really lucky to have Brihat Parasara. And this again was discovered shortly after we discovered Neptune. Okay. Now, upon discovery of Neptune, now it's time to get more serious that's really when the New Age motion started, That's when the Vivekananda came west. That's when the whole let's move the spirituality up a notch motion started. Part of that was actually the discovery of Brihat Parasara. The other part of that discovery was it wasn't until around that same period, shortly thereafter, in the early 1900s, that they found all 4 chapters of Jaimini. Before that, only 2 chapters of Jaimini were available. And then in Nepal, I believe it was Nepal, if I remember correctly, they found the rest of it. Okay. So what I consider the 2 most useful books didn't show up until we rediscovered Neptune. Okay. Okay. Which is really, really interesting because that's really the planet of spiritual growth, basically, So, and that's also when we had moved, according to Jyotish theory, firmly into the Dwapara Yuga, which is the age of, more self-development and not just such a material age and more emotional development. So, for some reason, these books were kind of neglected throughout the Dark Ages. They simply weren't available in full. Okay. Now, like you mentioned, when you first get those classics, especially something like Brihat Parasara, which is so big, Brihat Parasara means, the big book of astrology by Parasara, and it is big. And when you first get that, we start reading these sutras, and it could just seem like utter nonsense. And the reality is, most people don't spend enough time with it. They read it, they get indigestion or go, what the heck? And they ignore it. It's ignored in India as much as it is everywhere else. I mean, most Indians are not any more capable of reading a classic Vedic astrology book than someone in the West.
Mm.
When I first read Brihat Parasara, I had Astrology of the Seers, which I stumbled across at a bookstore. From that, I ordered Brihat Parasara, which was the only classic available in America at the time. Okay. I just read it from beginning to end.
Wow,
And
that's quite a
that
feat.
point, at that point, I was basically an idiot when it came to astrology because there's no way I was going to be able to make any of that useful or even understand any of it. And I realized how overwhelmed I was. So what I started doing at that point, I literally went to the first sutra in the first chapter and I wrote a commentary on it to myself. So I wrote everything I could think about that made me think relevant to astrology. And I just went through the book sutra by sutra.
Mm.
My one book, Graha Sutras, is actually the result of of me doing that. It's the polished version of the planet of this chapter on the planets from that book, from
Mm.
doing that. Vault of the Heavens, also all the Vault of the Heavens book was all for me doing that, and it was a more polished version. Okay. So with sutras, the sutra means a thread. It's not a paragraph. Sutra means thread, not paragraph or not sentence. Okay. With the sentence, we say something, we make a statement. With the paragraph, we make several statements that give a greater meaning and wholeness to something.
Mm.
A sutra is a thread, and a thread is something you pull on until the whole sweater unravels, or more creatively, it's a thread we pull out of a ball of yarn and knit into a canopy of understanding. And so with these books, that's really how we have to treat a lot of the subject matter. Okay. Which means we have to simply take it, think on it, learn from it. The beautiful part of that is at that point, we're learning from our higher intelligence. We're creating our own thoughts. We're thinking for ourselves. We're developing a unique astrology based on our experiences, our wisdom, our understanding, and our need. Okay. And that's much more rewarding than reading what somebody else's ideas are about something and just soaking those up and adopting those and becoming a parrot.
Mm.
The ancient writers, they were about self-knowledge. And that's why they had this thing called sutras. Take this, learn from it. This is just to get you started in a process of learning that will blow your mind. That's what a sutra is. Now, in all the classical books, there's certain things that are, true sutras, which means you need to take them and work with them. And wow, like the Lajitadhyavastas,
Mm.
it's half a dozen sutras. And I've taught about 350 hours of different stuff on Lajitadhyavastas.
Mm.
That's what a sutra can do. There's only a few sutras of that great importance in any astrology book. Okay. The majority of what we see in the old astrology books is simply yogas. If this is with this is the result. You get this many elephants and horses and whatever. Okay. Those are very simple. You don't need to spend a lot of time on those. All you have to do with those is test them on a bunch of charts and see if they work consistently.
Mm.
Some will, some won't. The ones that you find working out consistently to a satisfactory level you want to use. The other ones, you just throw away.
Mm.
Not all the yogas are great in any of the books. Okay. But because yogas don't take any thinking, you just see, is it there? Yes or no. Then those were what became the popular part of astrology, where astrologers in ancient India, in medieval and later India, until the early 1900s, late 1800s, they would simply remember as many yogas as they could.
Mm.
When they looked at the chart, they would just see what yogas popped out at them and do the reading based on that. Shikshashwar complained about this and said astrologers need systematic systems of astrology that are scientific. But no one was doing astrology that way. By no one, I mean the collective mass. Of course, there was someone somewhere doing it. But shortly after the discovery of Brihat Parasara and all four chapters of Jaimini, people started developing systematic systems of astrology where we have a technique that covers it. The first that I know of, the earliest person I know who to do this was Krishnamurti. And he developed the Krishnamurti Parati system of astrology. Okay. And in the last century, the 1900s, we saw the development of people trying to create systematic astrology and not just remembering yogas. That was old school. You remember everything. People don't want to remember anymore. People don't remember thousands of lines, you know? Now it's time for us to think, and through that thinking, discover the knowledge inside ourselves. So it's a very appropriate time for sutras, actually, you know? So there are some sutras that take deep thought to get the true full meaning out of. With the yogas, we have to give them deep thought to see how does that apply to modern life? How does getting 90 elephants, 4 wives, and a treasure chest full of gold apply to my modern world? So we have to, even those yogas now, we have to use as sutras, which we have to say, okay, based on the planets that are forming this yoga, what does it really mean in this day and age where no matter how much I want to, I'm never going to have even a single elephant, Okay. And I say that for those who don't know, because so many of the yogas, one of the things they give you is elephants, because elephants were a very important thing. That's like a Corvette or a nice pickup truck, It's more like a nice pickup truck, right? Horses, now that's the Corvette. So basically now you're getting pickup trucks and Corvettes, okay? So you have to take the planets and understand how these planets, okay, they're creating this good type of result, but what does it really mean? And you can really think deeply on that. And that's what I did with the Core Yogas book, is I wrote about trying to figure out what do these yogas mean today, So yogas is a big part of astrology. That was the primary part of astrology in the ancient times. And which, not by ancient, I mean medieval, not previous to that. Previous to that, astrology was very systematic. Okay. So like previous to 100 AD, astrology was much more systematic. Okay. But nowadays, yogas are very neglected. And people try to follow schools of thought from various astrologers that say this system works. This is how we read a chart. This is how it's done. Okay. And most people know very, very few yogas. Okay. So it's really changed a lot. So amongst books that are classical, the classic texts I think are the most important ones to have. Okay. One of them, of course, is Brihat Parasara. One of the best things about the Brihat Parasara is the named yogas. It has a majority of the yogas that have a name. Okay. The yogas that actually have a name, like Gajaka Yoga, Lakshmi Yoga, these type of yogas, these are the more important yogas. Okay. That what they have in common, they give wealth, success, and some good qualities of character. Because they give all three of these most important things, they're given specific names. Okay. But they all basically give those three things through different mechanisms of the planets forming them. Okay. Brihat Parasara has the best selection of those. The other yogas in Brihat Parasara, like the yogas on children and the yogas on this, they're actually very mediocre yogas. And they're not, there's a few good ones, but many of them are not consistently correct. Okay. So I don't consider Parasara a great book for yogas other than the named yogas. What Parasara is great for is mathematical astrology, which is the Shadbala, the Ishta and the Kashta, the Digbala, the Chestabala. But those are sutras. It took me over 20 years to be able to get a lot of that stuff to work usefully. Some stuff I did in a few years, like Shadbala was only 7 years, okay? But there's some stuff to really find a really lovely use I couldn't live without. Took over 20 years, okay? So these are like some difficult parts. And some of them no one even pays attention to, really, maybe in a very casual way, but not in a mathematical way. So Parashara is the best book for mathematical astrology. Okay. There's another book about mathematical astrology, and it's Sri Pati Parati,
Mm.
and I find it useless. I don't like that book. It disagrees with some stuff from Parashara. I don't think it's correct. I don't think it's a useful book. I played with it and I've never gotten anything useful from that one.
This is
The
the
math,
one with the unequal houses, isn't it? He mentions a lot about the
yeah,
calculation of,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Okay. So when it comes to mathematical astrology, Brihat Parasara is the book. Okay. Another very important part of astrology is the Avastas. Brihat Parasara is the only book that has all 5 different varieties of Avastas. The Avastas chapter in Brihat Parasara, while the boat was sinking, I only could take one chapter of any book I've ever read, it would be the Avastas chapter. Okay? That's the most valuable chapter of any book out there, in my opinion. But it's all very, you have to give thought to it. There's nothing free in that chapter, okay? No other book has all 5 Avastas. Most books have the Deeptati Avastas, where the Avastas based on dignities. Friend sign, own sign, or with a planet with a malefic has a Vikala impaired dignity. Those are very useful, but you'll find those in many books with some slight differences. Again, Parashara is the best place to go for the Avastas. Only 2 books I've come across have Lajitati Avastas. Brihat Parasara and Bhava Kutuhalam, okay, which is a obscure book that most people don't read, and it's not the greatest book by any means, you know. It's not a book I say you have to have this book. But if you want to get into the sutras yourself and really do the classical approach of studying the oldest stuff, Brihat Parasara is a must-have. Also, it's a must-have from the point of view of dashas.
Mm.
Has lots of stuff on dashas. It's a must-have if you really want to learn Ashtaka Varga, the classical deeper way. And it's a must-have for remedies. He actually gives remedies for dashas and antardashas, and they work. He gives remedies from the Vedas for planetary chanting that work, you know. Um, so it's a fantastic book. And then there's lots of other good stuff. Oh, one other very, very important thing I have to say about Parashara. Parashara has a large part of Jaimini in it. And all that, you want to tear those pages out and throw them in the trash. Okay?
Okay.
Because none of that is original Brihat Parashara. And what it actually is, it's simply a bad Jaimini rewrite that will mislead you and not help you in any way. Okay? So, see, what happened is throughout the period, people have been commentating on Jaimini, try to understand Jaimini in ancient India. By ancient, again, I meant medieval India. And they all honestly didn't do a great job. And what's in Brihat Parasara is simply an easier to understand but but incorrect version of truly translating Jaimini Sutras. So you cannot go there. Okay. That stuff is no good.
Mm.
It actually follows Jaimini Sutras verbatim in order practically, which again shows somebody just sat there and wrote it and somehow it got added into this. Okay. So I don't recommend the Jaimini parts in Brihat Parasara. Okay. Other chapters are largely great. The chapters on the planets and the Rashis, the best there is. So if
Mm.
we're getting your foundation of the basics, it's the best.
Mm.
Okay. So we're very, very, very fortunate. I would have quit astrology probably if I hadn't discovered Parashara. If Parashara had not been recompiled and I had not learned the Lajitati Avastas. Okay. I would, at this point, I'd be bored, you know, I think, because after a while, just learning another way to predict something, it's like, who cares? You know, life happens. Who cares? I'm going to go play, not predict when I'm going to play. Okay. So, um, oh, one thing I want to say about Parashara, the translation at times is off. There's some stuff on the planets that's simply stated wrongly. Like the colors of the planets are wrong. There's certain things that are simply wrong. The reason is because the people, and both translators have made the same mistakes.
Mm.
The reason is because the translators actually, the English translations we have were done by people who translated Hindi versions because it was easier for them to translate them. So we have a translation of a translation. And if
Right.
the Hindi version had an error, they both reproduced the error. Now, with that said, I prefer the Rajan publication better than the one that's translated by Sharma.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
I've got the Sharma one. Yeah.
The Rajan one is cheaper. It's not as well printed, but it actually is the better one. It's the earlier one too. The Sharma translation one, and that was by Sagar Publications, if I remember right.
Mm.
Um, in that he added a few extra chapters. Are they really authentic? Who knows? Are they important? Not really. That you don't need those chapters. One of them's on calculating the house costs with Sripati.
Mm.
Sripati's system of calculating house costs makes no astronomical sense, and that chapter I would just tear it out. Okay. What's nice about the Sharma version is the tables are nicer, the font's cleaner. I have both,
Mm.
so I can check both sutras. But when it comes to some critical things, there is some small problems, but not enough in the translations, but not enough to make it not worth reading. The majority of those are actually in the sutras on, it's just not quite clear enough or a little bit wrong on the sutras on the signs, the rashis, or the sutras on the what's it called? On the avashtas, on the Lajitati avashtas is not very clear. And the suit, it's not really correct, and it's not really clear how to do it based on that translation. And also on the planets, there's some mistakes. I've translated all of those to as good a level as I'm capable of in my various stuff. Okay. So
Mm.
if someone doesn't know Sanskrit, I really recommend that. Okay. If you want to read the Sanskrit. And when I translate something, I give you the exact translation and then my commentary.
Mm.
Some translators, what they do is they translate, but they're just giving their ideas on it, and you're truly not getting a translation. Okay. So Jaimini is the second very valuable book that I think is a really critical book. Problem is, Jaimini is not only written in Sanskrit, it's written in coded Sanskrit. And the Sanskrit is preschool level Sanskrit. It's the easiest book to read on earth in Sanskrit. Okay. It has no verbs. I mean, verbs are the hard thing in Sanskrit. It's pretty much a verbless book. Okay. And it's if you want to learn Sanskrit and translate something, translate Jaimini because it'll be the easiest book you can find to translate pretty much. But with that said, that's not going to help you because it's coded Sanskrit, so you have to break the code, right? If you don't, you'll be off course. And even after you break the code right and you have the sutra is the critical sutras are essentially riddles where he says something in a way that you're not sure what he means. It's not clear. And some of these sutras you have to dwell on for a very, very long time. As a result, different people have controversies about these sutras. And so Jaimini is extremely difficult.
Are we told that there's a code? I mean, do they hint at the,
And
that's
that the people who do the translations tell us some of the code, and then they don't follow it because they don't have the understanding to follow it. So they make things, they break the code where they can't grasp the picture instead of just leaving a hole in their heads to get filled up in time. And time is the key. It's insane work. I remember I talked to Frawley about Jaimini, and he said, "Oh, when it comes to Jaimini, just forget it." And he's a Sanskrit scholar, that's
wow.
Jaimini for you. And so you have to be possessed to want to dive into Jaimini Sutras on your own, honestly.
Mm.
Unfortunately, the translations that are out there are full of errors and and the techniques don't work. The only translation I would recommend of that is the one I did of the first chapter. It's literal, where I translate it exactly. And if you just read the sutra, it won't make any sense to you. But you have the sutra decoded and you have the sutra in literal form. And now you can at least think about it and try to find the meaning.
Okay.
Okay. But all the other translations are commentaries, and a lot of them just copied down commentaries from Neelakanta, which didn't work either. So Jaimini needs a tremendous amount of work. Most of the Jaimini stuff that people are doing is not correct. And again, this is my opinion. You can shoot me or say I'm right. It doesn't matter. Based on my experiences of trying the things, okay? Jaimini needs a lot of work. Once I get done some with other things, I really plan on spending the last 20 years of my life only focused on Jaimini. That's when I'm going to disappear, and you're hardly going to see me except every 2 years when I break one Jaimini Sutra, because it takes that long.
Wow.
And we got hundreds of sutras. So if I can devote 20 years of my life, I hope I can translate the whole rest of the book. That's one of the things I want to succeed in. We'll see, you know.
Can I just ask you, like in Parashara, when you read through it, so you get introduced to the person doing the dialogue, they talk about the planets, it's quite a large section about upagrahas, as I seem to recall, and then you go into all this mathematical stuff. Book 2 is like hugely dedicated to Dasha, isn't it? And
Yeah.
that's the kind of format of it. But is the Jaimini Sutra the same? Is it kind of like or is it more like theorems that they present? This is an idea, because from my recollection of it, and of course I've only read English translation, it didn't seem like it was formatted like that. There wasn't that sort of introduction and leading you by the hand. It felt it was more like just dive in and start.
Oh yeah, it's just dive in. It's like dive in, fill your lungs with water, and turn that water into air. It's painful. One sutra stuck in my head for 2 years. And sometimes my wife would catch me staring out into space. When we're supposed to be having fun together, and she'd say, "What are you thinking?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'm thinking about you, honey, of course." And she would quote the sutra. She knew the sutra. And one day I'm just walking around somewhere and the sutra's in my head, and boom, I think, if I decode this word, it equals the number 10. I know it. It has to. There's no other way. And I went there, I decoded a word that no one had tried decoding, and boom, it was number 10. That's how Jaimini Sutras can work, some of them. It's very painful, very hard, very contemplative. And you don't know what he wants you to do until your insides learn it through some inner force. He's the greatest guide. I love Jaimini because he's really making us think for ourselves to find truth, not to think for ourselves and find stupid stuff. And it's a dedicated effort to do Jaimini, but it's a critical book because the stuff that's in Jaimini is not found anywhere else. So there's certain things that we need to do with astrology we only can do with Jaimini. Okay.
Could you give an example of something that just one thing that if you had to take one technique, which is amazing?
One thing, for instance, is like really understanding your spiritual life. Jaimini has the answer. What your career is. Jaimini is basically the astrology of what you are. This is what you are. You're an astrologer, or you're this, or you're that. This is how long you're going to be here to do that thing. This is your spiritual path and how you're going to benefit on a spiritual level and grow on a spiritual level. These are the diseases you're going to suffer from, stuff like that. These are the heights you're going to achieve in your life. It's a very concrete, this is how you're going to be type book. It's 4 chapters, and each chapter is cut into 4 parts. And he's emphasizing the number 4 to let us know that this is the concrete realities of your life here. Jaimini is concrete, okay? It's what's in stone, more than any other astrology text. Parashara, on the other hand, is much more mutable. It's the astrology that you can work with, mutate, where you have room for growth, shifting, and change. Jaimini is the concrete. And so the first chapter, he gives all the basics, and he gives the result. In the first quarter of the first chapter, he gives the basic principles, many of which are misunderstood to this day. And then he gives the results of the Swamsha, which he gives results of signs, your self planet, and what it's doing to make you who you are. And it basically says this is who you are is the second part of the first chapter. The third part has to do with the continuation of what you are, especially of how, your success in the world, things like that, some elements of that. The fourth part of the first chapter has to do with family life and children. Okay. So it's marriage and children. The next chapter is all about dashas. First, he has longevity dashas. Then he has dashas to predict events. The third and fourth chapters are an utter mess, and they have more corruption than the first two. There's even a few missing sutras. It's the most difficult because it's such a jumble of stuff. There's stuff on health. There's stuff on success. There's what's going to kill you, how you're going to die. It's just sutras on all kinds of stuff. And every 3 or 4 sutras is a whole new thing you're dealing with. So it's not like a chapter we're dealing with one subject for a whole section. Every few sutras, it's a whole new thing. And then you can literally spend 2 years on each of those parts, literally. Those are the chapters that need the most time and work. Very, very difficult chapters. And that's why I say 20 years instead of 5 years,
But does it give you more insights? Is there a different take on the way the planets manifest themselves, or
no?
It's the same. No. We're using the same material. We're just interpreting it a different way, or
yes, it's just different techniques with the basic materials. Now, the best thing about Jaimini that everyone could take advantage of right away is the karakas and the Rashi aspects. Okay, if you just start using Rashi aspects, which you can learn 5 minutes, you're going to be a better astrologer in 5 minutes. And then if you learn the karakas, so he gives the karakas like Jupiter rules this, Venus rules this. Well, Venus rules students. Did you know that? Who knew that, right?
No, I'm not saying I particularly associate with Venus.
Most people don't know Venus is your students. Okay. And then, and like I did that Trump video the other day on YouTube, people said, how is Mars the mother and Venus the father? I've never heard that. Where did you hear that? Well, that's from Jaimini. Jaimini gives the most accurate, useful karaka scheme for which people or what planet. It's 100% accurate. The other texts are not 100% accurate. So it's the book you have to go to for karakas. Then it also has the changeable karakas, the chara karakas, we call them, like your planet with the highest degree in a sign is the Atma karaka, has that stuff. Those are very useful. Now you can predict about all these people, things you would have missed, not knowing that there's these sort of invisible karakas out there, which means for one person, the moon is their spouse, for another person, it's Mars. It's a whole extra planet to consider. If you don't consider that planet, you're going to miss part of the picture. So really easily, between the karakas and Rashi aspects, a person can advance their astrology in 1 hour of study. And everything they know, just add those things and do everything else the same, and you've just advanced tremendously as an astrologer. Everything else in Jaimini, it's a lot more work. Okay. All that was in Jaimini, it would still be one of the most valuable books you can have.
Well, I was just concerned that somebody coming to that, obviously you've done the work and you've already kind of penetrated the sort of the more hidden aspects of that work, but a student coming to it, how would you advise they approach that book to digest that information?
The only people that should touch Jaimini Sutras are people who have studied Sanskrit or who are studying Sanskrit, and people who are crazy about astrology and can't stop thinking about it. Otherwise, it won't be useful to you
or read Graha Sutras and get a translation from you.
Or get a translation. And I wish I could recommend other translations. I own all the other translations. I tried them all, severely disappointed in all of them. The Brest translation, unfortunately, was done by a professor of Sanskrit in the 50s. And the last 2 chapters, he only commented on in Sanskrit. The last 2 chapters are completely in Sanskrit. The first 2 chapters have English translation and commentary. And he has a huge introduction commentary, but that book is not available. It's out of print. I might be able to get a digital copy. I'm working on trying to find that so people can have it freely. That's better than any other translation that has been done, but it's not perfect. But he definitely did the most research, compared to most versions. It's to me, it's especially critical if you want to translate it yourself. He's done the most research to deal with corrupted sutras. And he was a very good Sanskrit scholar. He actually created a Sanskrit dictionary for his university of Mysore. So now we need to focus on the other books.
Okay.
Yogas are largely neglected these days, but they are a fantastic way to do good reading. Okay. When I what I started doing is I simply took all the classics I had and I simply wrote down all the yogas into lists. So I took every book and I wrote down yogas on marriage, yogas on disease. And I created these huge lists of yogas. And as I was typing those in, some of them sunk in. And then one day someone comes over and said, I want to ask about my sister. They want to have a new baby, or they're going to have a new baby. And I see the seventh lord's in the fifth. And the yoga is the seventh lord in the fifth, there'll be no marriage and no children. And I also discovered that one of the reasons the seventh lord in the fifth gives no marriage, just through observation and practice, was that it inclines the people to affairs. So I simply said, no, she's not going to have a child. She's going to have an affair. And the woman said, no way. She goes, not my sister. They're totally in love. They have one kid. They want to have another kid. I said, no, she'll have an affair. Well, she had an affair. And this affair has been going on without being married to this guy for 27 years now. Wow. And she, of course, divorced her husband after 10 or 12 years. But she's never been married to this guy. She never had another kid. It's like, wow, you just know this yoga.
Mm.
I remember there was a really funny experience I had when I was at a convention and an astrologer was going to teach on yogas. And we talked about yogas. And I said, yeah, there's this really crazy one. You wouldn't think it would do this. I said, some yogas are so unique. Fifth lord in the seventh lord in the fifth, you think that would give you children and a nice romantic married life based on basic principles.
Mm.
The yogas that break the rules of the basic principles are the ones we need to know. And I mentioned that yoga, and he goes, oh my God, that's my life. I have that yoga, And he was like, wow. And so there's these yogas that people don't know that break the rules. Those are the most important. The books that have the most of those yogas, and the single most important book for yogas, I think every astrologer should get and use, is Jataka Tatvam.
Mm.
Okay? And that simply means elements of natal astrology, basically. Okay? And it's mostly yogas, and it has the highest percentage of yogas that work, and it has yogas by chapter. So first house yogas, second house yogas, etc., etc. It has the highest percentage of yogas that actually work, and it has the highest percentage of yogas that you don't think would work, but would work. Most yogas in most books are simply reiteration of basic principles. So studying those yogas, you don't need to remember them. You just need to grasp, oh yeah, here's that eighth lord ruining things again, like lots of yogas. If the eighth lord is here and you realize, yeah, the eighth lord sort of can cause trouble and upsets. So you don't remember all the yogas, and that you just need to remember the eighth lord causes trouble. So most yogas are actually just there to teach you the basic principles on another level. But there's some yogas, like the seventh lord in the fifth will give no children. That's like, well, I would not expect that, and it works. There's another yoga. When Venus and Moon are opposite each other across the first and seventh house, the person has no marriage. Who would think? When you learn Lajitadya Vastas, you realize why that yoga works, and then you don't need that yoga. But until then, you're like, wow, I would think that Venus and Moon opposite each other across the first and seventh would be a nice, cuddly, romantic marriage. Okay. So Jataka Tattva is the best book for yogas. The other very good book on yogas that also has a lot of unique yogas and a high accuracy rate is Svartha Chintamani. It also has some crazy stuff on Vargas, but I love it for the yogas. So those two books, for people who want to dive into yogas, The English translations are completely satisfactory on the yogas. You could just dive in them, start reading them, start writing them, start testing them, start trying them. And what's nice about yogas, it can really support your intuition in doing reading. See, no yoga is 100% accurate because there's also can be conditioning factors, different factors that are changing the picture. But if you memorize the yogas, not if you look at a chart and you go through a list, and you say, oh, these yogas are present. But if you memorize the yogas, your intuition, when you look at the chart, will pull out the yoga that relates to the chart that's actually going to come true. Because your intuition is picking up on everything in the chart that's contrary and supportive. And then it says, based on that, it's going to pull the yoga out of your memory. That's going to let you say the thing that's going to happen. So I won't just, there'll be people who've come into my office who've had the seventh Lord and the fifth, and I never even noticed it because it wasn't going to work on them because of some other factor. But on this person, I just went right to it because my intuition knew this is what I have to pay attention to. The way intuition works in a chart, it tells you what to see and what not to see. And it'll make you blind to things that you will blunder in. And but that only works if it's in our bodies. If we have it memorized verbatim. If it's just something we have to go through a list or what was that yoga? Let me look it up. It's usually not going to work. Okay. I remember one time I had just learned a yoga. If the Navamsha Lord of the Lagna Lord or the moon is in the 12th, the person will be poor. And I pulled up a chart, and the next day or 2 days later, I got a chart, and I said, oh, and I wonder if that yoga is present. And it was. And that yoga made the reading for the person.
Right.
It's once or twice since then in over 20 years that I bothered looking for that yoga. But if I hadn't done it that one time, she wouldn't have got what she needed. So by learning things, memorizing things, our intuition can guide us. So those are the two very, very good yoga books. Okay.
How many of those kind of ended up in core yogas? Your book? Did you
None of those?
None of them.
Because the core yogas has the named yogas. Maybe there's a few. I don't. But most of the named yogas come from Brihat Parasara Hora Shastra. Okay. Those yogas have more yogas based on houses. So they're not named yogas. The named yogas are important. All the stuff with names and prasha are very important yogas. The Nabas yogas are critical yogas and they're completely ignored because people don't know how to use them correctly. It's all covered in core yogas. So those are all important yogas. Now, the last book that's kind of a blend of what you get in Brihat Parasara and what you get in Jataka Tatvam and Svartha Chintamani is Phaladipika. Okay. I believe that's the go-to book for heart to foe. It's a good translation, and it offers a lot of value for the amount of pages in it. Okay. And it doesn't have anything that you have to pull your hair over for 5 years. Okay. So it basically has a lot of good elements like Parashara. It has good named yogas. It has some of the best yoga results, like most clear way of dealing with certain types of it groups some types of yogas together into a systematic whole. So it's a more systematic approach to yogas. The yoga stuff is great. It has basic stuff on planets, etc. It's all good. It has a good chapter on Ashtaka Varga. It basically is the same at Brihat Parasara on the Ashtaka Varga. One of the things that's invaluable there that I haven't found in any other books is a chapter called When the Bhava Gives Us Fruits. And in there, he tells us how to use transits to predict the exact day an event will happen. And I've taken what it's in that chapter, I've developed it to a much larger level. But when I first started doing it exactly in there, I instantly started being able to predict events to the exact day they would happen. And I've never seen any other book any other Vedic astrology book that has a chapter on how to predict the day an event happens with transits. So Phaladipika I consider one of the critical books that if I hadn't found, there'd be certain things I would simply not know how to do in astrology that I use in every reading.
Mm.
Okay. So I would say that could be one of the best first books to get. In fact, if you're just going to get one because you don't want to give up the whole rest of your life and not talk to your wife for 3 days at a time, just get Phaladipika. Okay. Lots of good stuff in there. It's handleable, it's manageable. And if you survive that and you find yourself being able to use a classical book, then dive into the others.
Mm. I just curiously, I noticed that one of the books you listed in your books that you'd like to talk about was the Yavanajataka. I was surprised that
Oh,
you
yeah.
listed that as one
Oh,
of yours.
I forgot. Yes, Yavanajataka. It's a critical book. A lot of people don't like it because it's Persian. Yavana is the Persians. Other people who can't admit how great it is say, yo, Yavanas was just some tribe in India. It's actually an Indian book, you know? It's like if it's not from India, it's not good, right? Well, we have to think differently because we're not from India. So um, Yavana Jataka is the earliest fully fledged astrology book we have in Sanskrit. It's from about 50 AD. It covers so much stuff. It has what's really interesting of it, it has a lot of Varga symbology. If you want to really get into Varga symbology, he gives pictures of Navamshas, Saptamshas, Horas, Drakanas. And that book had a huge influence over Varaha Mihira's work, which influenced Saravelli, who was also influenced by Yavanajataka. So much of North Indian astrology was influenced by this Yavanajataka book. So whether it actually came from Persia or whether it actually is of Indian origin, the reality is North Indian astrology has been largely influenced by this book.
Mm.
Okay. It has a lot of interesting things. Um, if you really want to get into Varga symbology, use it. It's a very interesting book. I don't think it's as important as the other ones to actually be able to hand-on use charts competently.
Mm.
But if you want to go deeper into Vargas, um, it has some good stuff. So I would consider it a good book for someone who wants to take Vargas to a very symbolic level. But I find it takes a lot. It's not, you just read it, it's easy, but actually take it and use it is harder because there's so much you have to memorize. Oh, what is that symbol? It's not like the
Mm.
symbol is an egg. The symbol is this whole paragraph of stuff happening.
Mm.
And so unless you like looking things up all the time, or unless you can remember a tremendous amount of stuff, it's a book you just don't end up using the stuff in as much as you could.
Mm.
Okay. What really needs to happen with that book, in fact, maybe I'll do this for the next version of Kala, is I need to program all those symbols into Kala basically. So you can see, oh yeah, these are all the symbols for all your Varga positions. That would be making it so much more user friendly. So
Mm.
it's an important book because it's unique. It's important because it influenced Varaha Mihira, who had more influence on North Indian astrology than anyone else. Um, from a scholarly point of view, and someone who it's very important, and it's the oldest Sanskrit book on astrology we have. Now, Jaimini Sutras was probably penned before that. Um, you know, based on linguistics, the professor believes it was probably penned between 300 and 600 AD. However, people didn't regularly have translations of Jaimini in the Dark Ages. Like I said, the last two chapters were only discovered much later.
Mm.
Neelakanta, who did extensive Jaimini translations in the Middle Ages, he only had the first two chapters. Never saw the second two. They thought it was thought those would be gone forever.
Mm.
You know, so yeah. So those are the books. It's just a handful of books, really.
Mm.
Unless you're going to go crazy, you don't even want to get Jamie. It's just going to drive you mad.
Mm.
You have to be mad to read a book that will drive you mad. Otherwise,
I mean, I've got a
that way.
digital copy. I have a digital copy of it, but I must admit it's not one that's ever really called to me. I mean, I've spent more time with Mihira. I mean, I like is it the Brihat Samhita because it's got all that omenology in it, and I like the bit about the minerals and making artificial gemstones and how to read clouds. I mean, it's a little bit, it's that kind of
Yeah.
emitter, this sort of the omenology side of it, which appeals to me. But Yeah, and some of these books, the Yavanajataka I like because it's a sort of scholar, it's very scholarly. Like we should say it's a two-volume set. First volume is just all in Sanskrit. Second volume is the translation, but it's heavily detailed. It's beautifully written. It's all lovingly sort of penned, but it's not an easy assimilatable book. You don't just like you say, you don't just read it and suddenly you feel like you can take something away from it. It's a more of a scholarly work. But yeah,
Exactly.
some of the other ones you've mentioned today, obviously Brihat Parasara I had, but it was interesting to hear about the other ones. It's given me more of an interest in them. Now I'll go back and revisit those because of what you said and have another look. So that's what I wanted to get from you really. It's like what would you choose and why? And what would be your reasoning behind it? Just one thing I wanted to pick up on, going back to Brihat Parasara. But the bit I was going to ask you was, why do you think the upagrahas are given such a big chunk at the beginning of that book? You go in, you've got the grahas, and then there's this huge, well, it's not huge, but it's a fairly sizable piece on the upagrahas. I mean, why does he put them so early on, and why is there so much about them, do you think?
Yeah. There's some astrologers in India that won't look at a chart if they can't calculate Gulika, which is the upagraha of Saturn. Gulika, or also called Mandi, is the only upagraha that any of the texts ever mention in actually being used. I think there's a lot to upagrahas. I just think we don't really know what they're doing yet. I think it's an area that needs to be researched more deeply. There's also many controversies about how to calculate them, so it becomes very difficult. But I don't think they're as important as the actual planets that we're seeing in the sky.
Mm.
And maybe there'll be a point where what can be dredged out of the planets is not as great as what can be dredged out of the upagrahas. And then I might want to focus on them more, someone else might want to. But you know, it's really a matter of where how much information that's useful can you dredge from this or this source. And there's something to the upagrahas, but I'm not really sure what it is. I've played with them, I've worked with them. I've never found the magic of the upagrahas yet, like I did of the Lajitaya Vashtas. Maybe one day somebody will really show us how to use upagrahas in a really deep and profound and useful way. Because I feel like there is a lot of emphasis in Brihat Parashara on them. There's even chapters that give the meaning, the results of them. But then you apply those chapters to your chart, it doesn't really help you. It doesn't really make
Mm.
sense. I also wanted to say that, Brihat Samhita that you mentioned, for people who want to get immersed in the world of omens, there's nothing like that written on earth. It's a remarkable, overwhelming, super cool, fun book to read. It's a book I've always wanted to dive into more, but never had enough time. I think maybe one day someone will come and devote their life to that book. It's a book that a person could devote their life to
Mm.
and write an extensive commentary with experiences backing it all up. And that would be really remarkable. Um, then there's different types of astrology. Like another book I really recommend. Um, the classic is a decent translation is Tajika Neelakanta. Okay, Tajika system is the Persian astrology that was preserved in India in many ways better than it was preserved in the Persian regions. And that basically, they do all their predictions with solar returns.
Mm.
And solar returns is a fantastic way to do predictions. In fact, somebody asked Casey what the most accurate astrology was, Vedic astrology techniques to predict Western astrology or Persian, or Vedic astrology or Western. And he said Vedic astrology had better predictive techniques at that time, but that Persian astrology had better predictive techniques.
Mm.
And Tajika is the Persian system. And people who learn the Tajika system of using solar returns find it's easier to make predictions with solar returns than it is with dashas.
Right.
So for people who want to predict, I always strongly recommend you learn solar returns, okay, which is the Tajika system. Tajika Neelakanta is the book on that. It's not an easy book, but people have written on it and shown how to use it. Charak has done a really good job in explaining how to use it. I have courses on it, and I'm working on a book on it. Um, so there is some good sources out there on that system. And then when it comes to prajna, if people want to cast charts from, answer a question, Tajika Nilakanta also covers prajna. It's the most simple and very useful, accurate method of prajna.
Mm.
If a person wants to lose their mind over prajna, there's a book called Prasna Marga, and it's a volume set, published by, or the better translation, I believe, is by B.V. Raman,
Mm.
who was a very competent at prajna himself. And that book has a whole different school of techniques. I mean, completely different everything. It's like learning astrology all over again.
Yeah.
And it's so different, you almost don't want to read it, you know? Um, but it's a useful book. And then, of course, the other specialties are the Muhurta books, which we talked about last time. Um, and, and so that's between all those books,
It's a
you're
lot.
not going to be able to study in your lifetime all that. And there's really no other books that are going to have anything that you really need that's not in those books, in my opinion. So a lot of the other classics, I don't think are really worth spending the time with, because you're not going to be able to spend time with those and get through them all anyway.
Mm.
And so while I have every classic that exists, most of them are kind of fancy dust collectors at this point. But those are the real valuable ones that without the knowledge in there, I don't feel I would be a competent astrologer in any way.
Mm. Yeah, I remember in Prajna Marga, there's like a whole section about just how to light the ghee lamp. So basically, you get the query and just light the lamp, and then you study the flame. Does it go
Yeah.
out? Does it flare? Does it start low and then get brighter, or does it start brighter and get low? And that tells you everything you need to know and the direction they come from. Like you say, there's a whole world
It's
of
it's
pain in there if you want to go into it.
it's a whole nother universe. It's like if you don't like this astrology universe, you want to try another one.
Yeah.
South India is where you go. And in South India, Prajna was king. They didn't have birth times. And from the Prajna, the astrologers could predict how you're going to die and when. Just from when you show up at their house for a reading. It's like, wow. And they could tell if you were possessed by ghosts, entities. It's like they predict your whole life from the Prajna, not just answer your question.
Mm.
But when you show up, your whole life is up for examination. So
There must be
they
there
were.
must be a crossover there as well, because I know in like some of the medical texts, some of the Ayurvedic texts, they talk about how to position the patient and look into the white of the eye, and what you're looking
Mhm.
for is a reflection to see if there's a ghost there or something. If they got like a ghost attached to them,
I got the Ayurvedic books. I bought them in India. I've never had time to crack them open though.
it's like an ocean as big as they're just.
Another ocean, and I'm still drowning in this one. So my suggestions on the books.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a great load of material there to be going on with. It was just great to have you give us sort of an overview of what you were looking for and why you picked that particular book. So I'm sure people will appreciate that. It just saves a lot of legwork. There's so many books out there. I always, when I'm teaching, I talk about sort of 25 different odd books that I've assembled over the years that are digital, most of them. But I talk about them and introduce them. But like you say, I mean, there's only probably a handful that I would actually use. It's just nice to know that there's material out there and people have specialist subjects. They might be interested in Mahata or Prajna, and so they will go to their go-to book. But just I wanted to hear from you what you thought were books that that you
Well,
would use.
and the other thing I need to say is that when we approach it from our Western mind of how we're used to reading the classical books, our brain has an issue with them. It can be hard to jump into them with no knowledge of astrology at all. And there's so many good authors out there now. When I started, we had Beaver Ramon, one or two other books, and just a couple Canberra books had been out by then. And really, Beaver Ramon was the go-to in English. And Beaver Ramon's books were not easy by any means. Later authors have written in a much more readable, easy fashion. But the amount of information in a lot of Beaver Ramon books is a tremendous amount of information. But at first, reading classics could just be too overwhelming, and just reading any astrology book you can find is worthwhile. I'm not familiar with what's out there anymore as far as new books. Man, a lot of authors written a lot of new books. Eventually, from studying sutras, my brain got to the point that it does not like to read normal books anymore. My brain doesn't appreciate a paragraph formatted book anymore. I struggle the same way I used to struggle to read sutra type books. My brain is now rejecting books written by people who are just writing all these paragraphs.
Mm.
And my brain doesn't want to do that, doesn't want to play that game anymore. So, but when our brains are used to reading that way, and we got to get familiar with stuff and learn some basics, any book has is going to have a lot of good stuff on it. And people who've looked at classics have put things together that will help you when you get into the classics. But with respect to the classics, there's a lot of stuff in those classics I mentioned that people aren't regularly using or writing. Like yogas are not being used enough. So that's why I consider these important books. So there's some very basic things. I mean, most Vedic astrologer I know do not know how to use transits to predict an event to the day. Yet it's in Phaladipika. So these books all have stuff in them that I find regularly are very useful that we don't find most astrologers doing, because most astrologers are doing a very basic form of Parashara astrology with Vimshatri Dasha, and it's just a small aspect of what we can possibly do. And it's popular because it's proven a certain amount of reliability. But predicting to the day with dashas, good luck with that. It's possible you're working down to the fifth level dasha, but it's insanely hard to do. Whereas with transits, it's not that hard. So
that was a great overview. Thanks for doing that. Really appreciate it. If people want to get in contact with you, I'll put up the website and all the books. I highly recommend. Ernst has got lots of books. You've got they can all. You can still get them all, can't you? Except for core. No, maybe the.
You can get them all, but not all of them are available in print form. I got to get some of them back into print. I hope to get back to that this year.
Okay. I should mention also, it's like if people just want to get a taster of some of the Indian books, I think it's archive.org, Internet Archive. You can get a lot of free PDFs on there. So if you just want to download to have a look and see what's in there, you can use that service. But I would always recommend buying the books. One, it's nice to have a hard copy, and two, it's good to support the author. So don't buy sort of just digital copies. But just for quick referencing,
a lot of digital copies, especially if you are Indian and you read Hindi. You'll find lots of old translations that are in the public domain at this point, of books that, like, there's one book that's pretty useful called Vriddha Yavanajataka, which means the old Yavanajataka, but it was actually written after the Yavanajataka.
Okay.
And that book has some good stuff in it, but it's only available in Sanskrit with Hindi translation. You can't get it with English. That's one of the books that needs to be translated into English by somebody. But it gives a little bit of a different view, but it's not irreplaceable, but it would sure be nice to have it. Okay. So if you can read Hindi, you can find so many books that we don't get in English still.
Really great. Thanks for coming on and speaking. And yeah, hopefully we'll catch up again soon. So thank you again, and fantastic.
Bye-bye.